welcome to a blockbuster episode of the Beyond Sports Broadband Edition with me, Digvijay Singhdeo. My guest today is one of the all-time greats of Indian sport. He was a natural on a tennis court. He could shake and stir it with James Bond on screen. And he's someone whose booming baritone and on-screen persona continues to inspire the likes of yours truly. Vijay Amritraj, thank you so much for joining me. It's a 12 and a half hour difference from where you are on the west coast of America and where I am here in Delhi. And thank you so much for taking time out and for both of us managing to figure out how to do this.
I know, I know. Thanks for having me, Diggy. This is a first for me as well.
Of course, how difficult has it been for you over there? Because the area where you are, it's a major COVID-19 hotspot. So how difficult has it been for all of you, for your lives, the family, and everyone else?
Very much. As a matter of fact, in the U.S., it has spread dramatically, starting in New York, of course, which is the hottest bed in the country. And because of the density of population, the subways, the buildings close to each other, people coming out on the streets on a regular basis. Rest of the country, at least, there's a little bit more of travel by transport, and so it makes it a little bit less spreading because of people not one on top of the other. But I think to a great extent, New York, and once you travel in and out of New York, it has made it even worse.
Yes, Vijay, you travel across the world. You've been an ambassador for India across the world. You've seen the world much more closely than someone like I have. But do you think that, when we were growing up, we used to read about true leadership in the times of crisis. Do you think that this current pandemic has shown up a lot of leaders across the world as having no idea how to deal with this crisis?
It's like we go back to the old saying, even in our sport, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and we are all aware of it in every walk of life. And the strength and character of an individual, of nations, of communities, of states, cities, countries, all of it come out in times of difficulty. And I think the important aspect here is how well are we able to get together being alone? And that's the hardest part. And I think that's where it tosses up leaders. Yesterday, Britain and the rest of the Allied forces celebrated 75th anniversary of the winning of WW2, and it was an incredible speech that Churchill gave at that time to be able to really influence the defeat of the German Nazis during those days. And I think when you celebrate something like that, you realize what leaders can do to be able to help those countries in those times of need. And I think you're exactly right. It's important that our leaders know that, which I'm sure they do, because that's what they're going to be remembered for. 9/11 in the US, 26/11 in India, and so on and so forth. I think that's something that we hope and pray that our leaders can rise to those expectations.
Let's move away from the politics and let's get to sport. Wimbledon is cancelled. I know that's something which would have really pained you, but the next event on the calendar is the US Open. Still question marks over where about will the US Open happen, but the latest buzz is it could be heading to your neck of the woods. It could be heading to Indian Wells. That's the buzz.
Well, there are a lot of rumors floating around. There are a lot of statements that have been put out as well. And I think the latest is probably still nothing confirmed, which is they are hoping to make a decision by June 1st, is the last message that I received. We've been in touch with the USTA and the CEOs and the presidents and so on and so forth, and a variety of people there. And the feeling is that at the moment, as you probably know, the National Tennis Center in New York is still very much a makeshift hospital, and it remains that way. There are still, I think, about 500 beds in there, and that has not moved yet because obviously there's still so many daily deaths that are taking place, and people, and of course, Governor Cuomo in New York State needs to be able to keep that option open. But at the end of the day, what is the two choices on the table for the US Open is either play the tournament without any fans or potentially move the tournament to the West Coast and into Indian Wells, into the city of Indian Wells, which is about a 2-hour drive from Los Angeles. But unlike any other league sports in this country, in the United States, the aspect here is we still have a ton of players who are all international players coming from different parts of the world. And that is a very difficult thing to coordinate, because are they going to be tested every single day? That's what would have to be done for them to be able to go out there and play freely and make contact. Even to run a US Open, you need something like 4,000 to 5,000 people to just run the event. And even if you don't have any fans, I think the important aspect is that social distancing would have to be kept within that situation.
Yes, and we've seen that slowly emerging, aren't we? Football started in South Korea. The German Bundesliga is supposed to start next weekend. But Vijay, the thing with tennis and golf is that it's a professional sport, and the players, as you said, come from all over the world. Now, various countries still don't have flights operational. Will it be fair to hold tournaments when you're when a certain section of players are not able to come in because of, say, A, travel restrictions, or B, quarantine regulations?
Excellent point, Diggy. I mean, I think the important aspect is I just heard on the news last night that end of the month, end of this month in May, potentially there will be a 2-week quarantine for anybody coming into the UK. And, that's probably going to be the case because lots of countries are going to have to watch their borders and make it a little bit more local. So that being the case, travel of flights coming in and players coming in and so on and so forth is potentially the last thing that could happen, and which makes it even more difficult to run an event of international caliber like the US Open.
Look into the crystal ball, if I could say so, because how does sport change now? Social distancing is the new buzzword, especially till we find a vaccine. That's at the moment doesn't look likely for the next 2 or 3 months as it stands. Sports like tennis, sports like golf, when you're in close proximity to each other, sports like football, where all the players are sitting on that one bench in the dugout. Even in a lot of your sports in America, all these sports, how do they sort of adapt to the new normal, Vijay?
Well, let me isolate golf for a moment. And at the end of the day, the only person he's standing next to is his caddy. And the caddy can certainly maintain social distancing, and he can pick up his own club from the bag. The important aspect, for example, the golf courses in California just opened yesterday. And if in clubs or public courses, you can actually go out and go on walk the course or go on a cart on your own, which is completely sanitized, they're allowing you to do that, and you're one person in a cart. And they're saying that the next tee time would be 10 minutes behind you. So you're really not seeing anybody at all. So from a golf perspective, they're even considering playing the Augusta Masters later this year without any fans. So that potentially could happen in golf. Whereas in anything else, the contact is too close. Even in basketball, contact is close, though every player can be tested every day to make sure that everyone is clean before he actually gets out to play that particular game, of the 5 players on each team with no fans. No fans might end up being the immediate new norm, in my opinion.
That was also one of the proposals being mooted about the IPL, perhaps get all few teams into one setup. That obviously didn't work out at the moment. But just looking at tennis, where do you think this is going to leave the big players? Because Roger Federer, the last we saw him, he had surgery and he was missing the season. Of late, he's become a sort of a social media phenomenon. And we've last seen him hitting balls against a frozen wall in Switzerland. Rafael Nadal has admitted he hasn't touched a tennis racket except the virtual one since Indian Wells. And Novak Djokovic got into trouble for trying to, I think, break quarantine norms is somewhere in Spain. How is this going to pan out for the big players? Even Andy Murray, we didn't know when he's going to come back.
Well, look at it from everyone's perspective, and there are various categories of players that we have to address here, because obviously the top 3 guys, they, as I've always said, they're not even chasing history; they're chasing each other. And I think when you look at Federer at 38 years of age, and in August his next birthday comes around, every 6 months makes a big difference to the rest of his or the end of his career. And he certainly will be looking to keep his nose in front of Nadal and Djokovic from a majors winning standpoint. Now, Nadal missing the French Open in May he would have probably been the front runner to win the French Open. Had he won it, he would have been at 20 as well, along with Federer going into Wimbledon. Djokovic, on the other hand, is also not very far away. And had Federer won those 2 match points last Wimbledon, he could have been 5 or 6 Grand Slams away from Djokovic. Now, all of a sudden, things are getting very, very close. So the competition for them, I don't think they're chasing money. I don't think they're chasing their own history, because they've all made history in their respective careers. It's only a question of chasing each other and how long they can continue to do that. The lesser guys are losing a year. The Themes, the Medvedevs, the Tsitsipas's, and all of them have a long way to go before they can catch these great champions. So it remains to be seen. The lesser players are the ones who are struggling, because some might have had a momentum going into Indian Wells, and once Indian Wells got cancelled, they lost that big ticket to be able to do well. So these kinds of things are the concern. But one thing is common, and that is nobody on the tour, both tours, have touched a tennis racket.
Yeah, that's true. But you have these virtual tournaments, but let's face it, that's not the
No,
real deal there.
no.
But you've seen this generation and this rivalry evolve from the very beginning. Thanks to your role as a keen watcher of tennis and on broadcasting on tennis, you've seen the rise of the Federer, the Nadals of the world, and then the Novak Djokovic. You know, you've had competitive rivalries across tennis across all the decades. But this one is special because for each Grand Slam since say 2003, 2004, it's the same 3, 4 players who've been right up there, either winning them or contending for them. This is a remarkable kind of rivalry that we've perhaps been blessed to see.
Well, I've said this on many occasions that we are seeing arguably the 3 greatest players potentially of all time, all playing at the same time, which very rarely happens, and for a long duration of time as well. So if each of them had played at different generations at different times, they could have all been considered the GOATs. So I think when you look at the 3 of them competing against each other on a regular basis at the highest level, we are actually blessed as a fan, as a tennis lover, to see this quality of tennis being played by 3 guys at the same time. And that's what makes it so special.
Yes, but Vijay, I remember you doing commentary on those outstanding Wimbledon finales that we'd seen over the years. At that point of time, say 2010, 2011, 2012, that period, if you said to anyone that Roger Federer is the greatest of all time, everyone would agree. Right now, as you rightly pointed out, the gap has narrowed to 1 or 2.
Yes.
Ultimately, when they decide who the greatest of all time is, what will it come down to? Will it come down to just Grand Slam titles? Will it come down to then you add the Olympic medals or you add the titles? Ultimately, it's going to be very difficult to pick just one.
Yeah, absolutely. Those conversations are best left for an evening of a bottle of wine and sitting by the fireside with your friends and having debates as to who among the men, who among the women have really earned that right to call themselves the greatest of all time. But I think when you go back and look at history, and you look back, generally you look at tennis after the Open era came into play in 1968, and we've seen a lot more and more of it on television now because people are looking back at recorded matches. We haven't been able to see anything else. And you look back, and I've been fortunate enough to have seen generational last Wimbledon. My last Wimbledon 2019 was my 50th consecutive Wimbledon. And so having seen Wimbledon for over 5 decades, I'm able to see and played against a variety of great champions over the years. But when you look back, you'll see that Rod Laver is the only one to have won 2 Grand Slams. And that is a record on its own that has stood the test of time since 1969. So for 50 years, we still haven't had one person come out and win a calendar slam, which is the Grand Slam was coined from being within the calendar year. Of course, when you see these 3 guys playing, nobody can argue with the fact that all 3 of them might qualify for being the greatest of all time. So, and then of course you go back and look at the women, and you see what Serena Williams has done, and you look at Steffi Graf, and you see she won the Golden Slam in '88, including the gold medal, and you look at Navratilova and see how many titles she won, and Billie Jean King won 20 Wimbledon titles in singles, doubles, and mixed. So you're looking at a variety of great champions. That's why we've always said that you can't compare generational champions.
because, as you said, you've seen these great eras. When you started out, you still had the great Rod Laver playing. You had John Newcombe, Ken Rosewall. You've beaten them all as well. That was a special era. It was feeding, but you've still seen that era. How do those three compare to these three?
Well, the Australians of those of that time, the late 60s, early 70s, and all through the 70s, and I've had the good fortune to have played all of them. My big claim to fame, of course, was beating Laver at the US Open in the third round and making the quarterfinal that year. But I think I look back at those and think what Harry Hopman did to all of those Australian players and the Davis Cup time. But those were the times of serve and volley. The serve and volley was literally mandatory to be able to win on most of the grass court events. And so when you look at the game today, it is completely a different style of tennis. You look at Wimbledon grass courts at the end of the 2 weeks, and you see the baselines completely chewed up. But the net is completely pristine because nobody has really been there much. So I think when you look at the way the game has changed, that has made a big difference to the dominance of the Europeans as opposed to what was always the domain of the Australians and the Americans.
Okay, but as that era moved on, then came the era of some good friends of yours, Jimmy Connors, John McEnroe a bit later, Bjorn Borg.
Yes.
You beat all of them as well. So that was again an era and a rivalry which really lifted tennis, and that's remarkable how tennis always every decade seems to sort of throw up these champions, and all these champions sort of elevate each other's games. And this generation was phenomenal as well.
You're absolutely right, Diggy. I think every generation has had some amazing rivalries, especially from all of us, from my perspective, the 70s and 80s when I played. We've had the best players of my generation, though I'd beaten all three of them, Borg, Connors, and McEnroe, were certainly the best of my generation. And people like us were just right behind them. You know, there was myself, Roscoe Tanner, Brian Gottfried, Raul Ramirez, Dick Stockton, the whole bunch of guys that were pushing the envelope. And every time those guys had a marginally bad day, we were able to get them. And so we know the quality of tennis and we know how good these guys were. Bjorn Borg winning 6 French Opens and then coming and winning 5 Wimbledons, being the only grass court tournament that he ever played, was incredible because the difference between clay and grass in those days was immense. The court was slow, the balls were heavy, and Wimbledon, the court was quick, the balls were lighter, and it completely changed. And I always said by the time Federer and Nadal came around that Nadal would actually win Wimbledon before Federer wins the French. And that's exactly what happened. And the only time Federer won the French was when Nadal lost to Soderling along the way. So I think when you look at the generational rivalries, you got to look back at Borg, Connors, McEnroe, and then post that you saw someone like Sampras and Agassi. They played some spectacular matches, and till we led into the Becker Edberg era, and then eventually into what we see today. So, but the dominance of these three guys has been truly outstanding.
No, but you don't give yourself enough credit, Vijay, because you've beaten all these when they were the best in the world. How many Indians can actually say I beat so and so when they were the best in the world? And,
Sure.
and I think that it's a remarkable credit to what you achieved back then, because where were we? Just look at where we were. I mean, you and your brother reached the Wimbledon semis at that point of time. Even Leander's dad tells the story how difficult it was to travel in the
Yeah.
90s. We're talking of the 70s, where foreign exchange, traveling abroad even once a year, and here you were all across the world, planting that Indian flag, as we would say.
Yes, absolutely. And that to me, I took great pride in it then. I take great pride in it today. And I think wherever you go, wherever you are, wherever you live, it doesn't really matter. You'll always have that Indian tricolor in your head, the Indian anthem in your head, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, when you look back at those days and to be able to see that when you played at Wimbledon, when you played in Davis Cup, and when you played in these major events, the tricolor flew because you were playing. And as you got further and further, deeper and deeper into the tournament, the Indians came out in great numbers to cheer you on, irrespective of which country in the world that you played in. And that's what energized you to play more and more and try to stay on the tour as long as you possibly could, because you wanted to have that elusive win. And when you beat the Borgs and the Connors and the McEnroes of my era, they were so special to me because it was so special to the people.
You mentioned Davis Cup, but there were two significant moments in your Davis Cup career, which itself was legendary. In fact, the Amrit Raj brothers, I have to add. 74 when you all reached the final, and then 87 to reach the Davis Cup final, not the Davis Cup as it's now, but back then when it meant a lot. And Akhtar Ali once told me that you were heartbroken when we didn't play 74. In a sense, was that the biggest regret of your tennis career?
Well, from an athlete's perspective, anytime you don't play a major event, especially the ones that you think you can win, as we always say, you cannot win it unless you're in it. So if you look back at those kinds of missed opportunities, if you want to call it that, excuse me, you think that yes, we were didn't given was not given the chance to put India's name on the Davis Cup. And since 1968, when tennis went open, that's the only two times we've been in the final. In 74, and then again 13 years later for us to get to the final again in 87. So, but 74 was a chance that we could have won. We potentially could have won 4-1. We could have even if it got tighter, it could have been 3-2. But we would have won 4-1 because Australia and America were both out of it. And they were the two best countries during my playing days anyway. So in 87, when we went all the way to Sweden to play them in Davis Cup in Gothenburg on the clay, uh, uh, we literally had 1% chance of winning. That's if all four of them hurt themselves. So I didn't think we had a great chance of winning, but it was a great effort for us to get to that final at that time, beating Australia in Sydney, which was one of our best efforts in Davis Cup. So I think when you look back at those things and say, well, yes, we got to two Davis Cup finals, a spectacular effort considering who we were and what teams we had, but the camaraderie on our team was strong. I was playing captain, and when by the time we were able to come off of my career, I was able to look back at both those finals with a great feeling of pride for India.
Okay, but there was a sort of a start, But where did we go wrong? You look at what's happening with Indian sport now, and when Abhinav Bindra won the gold in Beijing in 2008, it sparked off a new interest in shooting. And today, a lot of these kids who were going to the Olympics for the first time all sort of got inspired seeing him. In tennis, you had a legacy. You had the great Ramanathan Krishnan. Then there was you and your team. Then after that, there was a brief lull, but then came Leander, then came Mahesh, who took it to a different level, especially in doubles, by winning those Grand Slams. Then we had Sania. Yet Indian sport could never build on that. Why do you think it? Where do you think we went wrong? And as we stand today and we speak, Vijay, a Grand Slam singles champion is a long way off. Perhaps the closest anyone came was you.
Yes, I agree with you on all that you've said, and I think you're absolutely spot on right. We have to look back at certain things, and starting with society and culture and family and risk factor and all of that. When you look back 30, 40, 50 years ago and say, okay, my first trip overseas to the UK was 69. Uh, India was closed. It didn't open up till much later. When I went first as a senior, so to speak, 17, 18 years old, I left the country with 3.5 pounds in my pocket. And that's all you had. Uh, and fortunately, my brother and I traveled together. So we were able to lean on one another during those traveling days of staying in a bed and breakfast place for less than £1 in the UK and trying to play 3-4 matches a day to get better. So, times were different, yes. But at the end of the day, constantly people would ask, yes, you play tennis, what do you do for a living? And those questions couldn't be answered in those days because we were not making any money out of it till we actually started to do better. And when I won my first major tournament in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to have a huge prize money check to beat Connors and Laver and to win the tournament, all of a sudden the thought process started to change a little bit. And it took about 30 years through my entire career of sports to be able to explain to a parent in India, at least visually and vocally to a great extent, that this could be a profession. A sport could be a profession. But that thought process never existed and it's slow to change. This is the highest risk adventure of a profession that anyone can do is sport. If you're putting your life into one particular sport, it is potentially the highest risk adventure you can possibly have. And that's the point that we have to harp in India because we're not good at taking major risks. Today, yes, we have a lot of startups in India, a lot of venture capitalists who back up 30 startups, but only two may end up doing well. Similarly, you look at tennis and you look at our sport and look at sport in general. If you have thousands and thousands and thousands of kids playing the game, but we don't get any that many champions coming out of that risk factor that we put into it, and we've got to consider it and look at it like a startup.
Okay, another famous son of Chennai, like you, Vishwanathan Anand, I spoke to him some time back and he said that the world was moving too fast and the virus sort of took advantage. When all this ends, when we start to get back to normalcy, what are the lessons we as a human race, Vijay, need to take on board from this tough period?
I think to a great extent it's service more than anything else. Service to the family, service to your relatives, service to the community, the ability to forgive and move on, the ability to, you know, take these things out of your mind of why me sort of thing. And as the great legend Arthur Ashe said, when he was diagnosed with the HIV situation way back when that eventually killed him, took his life. He said it would be wrong of me to say why me, because when I won Wimbledon, I didn't say why me. And so I think when you look back at it and you look back at this and what have we learned from it, and what we have learned from it or continue to learn from it is the ability to stay strong, the ability to stay with family, the ability to stay with unity, the ability to be able to help your neighbor if you can, look after yourself first, because obviously if you're not healthy enough, not well enough, not capable enough, you cannot help the next person next to you. And whatever it is, helping one person is 100% better than helping no one. And to a great extent, we would learn that we are actually in a completely global situation because this thing didn't leave out any country. This pandemic didn't leave anyone out and didn't isolate the rich or the poor or the in-between or any particular society. It didn't have any religious favors and all of that. Nothing. It just went across the board. So I think it's important for us to understand all of that. And as a human race, we are in fact one.